Well, welcome everyone. Just wanted to welcome you to our webinar. We're so excited to have you here today, to have Pat Deegan here today, and thank you so much for answering our polls. I think the results are being shared right now that half of you have been to our event before, many have not, and some aren't really sure. So we're really excited to see new folks. I'll explain a little bit about our network in just a moment, but I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Christina Clayton. I'm one of the co-directors of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We're so excited to have Pat Deegan here today to talk about how supervision can help peer specialists remain peer when working on clinical teams. And we have Dr. Pat Deegan from CommonGround, Pat Deegan and Associates. We're so grateful you could join us. And we also just want to make first mention around our land acknowledgement and just asking that folks reflect on the lands on which you reside and work and acknowledge all the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who've been here since time immemorial. We always want to do work for justice and in their communities. So we have a great resource for native land to learn more about where you live and work. So next we'll go into the MHTTC network. So if you haven't been to our event or any of these events, it's a nationwide network supported by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. Our network includes 10 regional centers, as well as a national American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a national Hispanic and Latino center, and a network coordinating office. And if you didn't know, for about 30 years, an addiction technology transfer center network has existed. And then there's also one for prevention using the same structures. So we support resource development, dissemination, training, technical assistance, and workforce development for the field. And our Northwest region covers Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. In the Northwest MHTTC, our goals are the same as the network: to accelerate adoption and implementation of best practices, heighten knowledge, awareness, and skills, foster alliances and communities and diverse partners, and ensure availability of free, publicly available training and technical assistance like today. Our area of focus in the Northwest is evidence-based practices for serious mental health issues such as psychosis, but we offer training in a variety of other topics, including integrated care, suicide prevention, diversity and equity issues, school mental health, peer support, and trauma-informed approaches. And so how do we do that? We have free trainings, we have online courses, live events like this, learning communities. We have a newsletter and training announcements and resource libraries. So if you want to find out more, we'll get links in our chat at either now or later, so you can follow and sign up for our newsletter. Just some housekeeping today. You're muted and off camera. It's a large group, so we will share recording and slides and send instructions on how to obtain a certificate of attendance in a few weeks. We don't have formal CEUs, but sometimes you can use these kinds of things to apply. Please use the chat for any technical issues, saying you need help from our team. Just a shout out to Gabrielle, who's out there behind the scenes, if you just want to share a comment or greetings. But if you have questions for Pat, please do use the Q&A box, because I will be queuing those up as we go along and doing as much as we can to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. Lastly, your feedback is really crucial to our work. And, you can imagine SAMHSA funds this, but doesn't have any opinion on official, stance on this content. But they do ask that we have people do these, 2-minute evaluations. And I just want to say, we actually look at these every time, and they're aggregated. We don't know who said what, but we send them, in reports to our trainers. We take them very seriously, and we just want to know, how did this go for you? And it helps us design for future training and keep the free training coming. So thank you so much. We'll get a eval link in the chat near the end of the presentation. It literally takes about 2 minutes. So now to the good stuff. I'm so pleased to have Dr. Pat Deegan here again today. Her mission has been to help activate and empower mental health service users in their own recovery, to provide peer supporters and clinicians with the know-how to support people in their recovery journey. She's uniquely positioned to fill her vocation because she was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager, went on to get her doctorate in clinical psychology, and today leads a company run by and for people in recovery. She is a thought leader in the field of mental health recovery, has numerous peer-reviewed publications, has held a number of academic appointments, and has carried a message of hope for recovery to audiences around the world. In addition to her work on the CommonGround Program, she consults with OnTrackNY and has helped the team at the Center for Practice Innovations develop an innovative model for engaging young people under the NIMH RAISE Study. This model is now being adopted nationally. And so just want to welcome you, Pat, just to say a quick hello, and then we'll have our conversation. So if you want to say hi to everybody, hello. Yes, so great to have you. So I'm going to stop sharing because we're just going to have a little, I'm going to stop sharing, have a little conversation with you before we get to your material. And I just want to say, I'm so grateful that you're here. So today we're having you talk about supervision, helping peer specialists remain peer while working on a clinical team. And I'm guessing just with that title, it's because it's a challenge. And, you know, you have such a long history in this field and been such a pioneering person, you know, on your website that I was looking at, as I shared, for over 30 years, you've been a thought leader and a disruptive innovator in the field of behavioral health recovery. What do those terms mean to you in this context? I'd love to hear more because I love those terms. I love that description.
Yeah. So I think that mental health services have a long way to go in terms of becoming truly compassionate places where individuals who are experiencing vulnerability and their own distress can get the supports grounded in their dignity to build the life that they want to build. And that we still have a long way to go in order to get there as a mental health system. In other words, to make that short, I'm not satisfied with the way things currently are, and I don't want things to change. I don't want things to change. Change has been happening all along, right? Change has been happening all along. I want to see progress. And how is that going to happen? I have a friend who's a monk living out in the wilds of Nova Scotia, in a monastery out there. And he says, change, he said, we're very busy people. We're changing all the time. He says, change is like what we do in mental health systems is we rearrange the chairs on the deck of the Titanic in order to achieve a better view while going down. And I love that, right? I'm not interested in rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. What I'm interested in doing is disrupting current practices in such a way that we actually transform them into a kinder, gentler, and more effective human service. I want to see the human put back into the human services. And so I know that lecturing and carrying a message of hope is very important to inspire the hearts of our varied and very wide workforce around the world. And that's important, to be literally inspired to conspire in order to breathe that spirit and to share a vision of what's possible. But at the same time, what I've learned over all these long, hard years is that the transfer from training to practice is actually pretty abysmal. It's not good. And for someone who spends, I don't know, too many hours training a lot of people, that's difficult. So eventually what I came to in my work was, okay, since training isn't enough, not even nearly enough of what we need to disrupt and transform the system, I'm going to build tools. I'm going to build tools that embody the principles of recovery. And in and through using these tools, we will find ourselves and our practice transformed. So I'm very much, me and my company, Pat Deegan and Associates, are builders of tools. So we build CommonGround software that's used to help make shared decision-making a reality in the psychopharmacology consults. And peer specialists play a foundational role in helping people prepare to participate, to have another kind of conversation with their doctors. We have created the Hearing Distressing Voices simulation, which is used all over the world and is currently translated into a number of different languages, including it's being used and translated into Mandarin and being used in mainland China, if you can believe it. And it was interesting because when we were working with nurses in China, mainland China, to create the simulation, we had the nurses go out and talk to people who are currently in mental hospitals in China and ask them, what their experience of hearing voices was like. And the nurses came back to us and they said, well, these things the patients were saying was fascinating, but it's so different than what we read in our textbook. And I'm like, yeah, that's disruptive. That's transformative to have a nurse experience, wow, this person can describe vividly their experience of voice hearing in ways I've never heard it. So it makes sense to talk to people. I mean, it's good stuff. So we love what we do, and I consider it a great honor to be here today with you and to share where I've come down in the scheme of things. Build tools and they will come.
No, and it's our honor as well. And I can see in the chat, people are very excited to be with you today. I think you touched on such an important point, which is the insights people gain from talking to those experiencing this recovery or these challenges versus reading in a textbook and making assumptions or hearing, how to do the work. And I also appreciate what you said is you can train and train and train, but it, isn't making the system progress in the way that it should. And so you're kind of doing things at all levels, right? You're still doing trainings, you're still inspiring hope. And then those tools that you mentioned, I think, is really fabulous because you want to have things that are effective. And, I want to say, while our area of focus is evidence-based practices, I'm keenly aware that is not always the best practice, that there's nothing wrong with evidence-based practices, but you do have to think about on whom, was this researched and who got to participate, who had a voice in these tools or interventions. So nothing against those kind of things, but I just want to always know people like yourself and anyone out there that we're also open, to what are best practices known by communities and by people with lived experience and people in different cultures that are very, have things that have been working for millennia, and we don't always give that credence like we should. In thinking about your time in the field, what are some of the themes, that peer specialists have shared with you about their experience with supervision? I've shared with you earlier, I have been a supervisor, I've supervised peers, I've worked with a lot of peers over the years. And I can completely see that for anyone who's out there in our audience who is new to supervising peers, doesn't understand what the peer role is, we have, other resources that folks can learn about, and you've done a lot of events. But when you've worked with peer specialists, what have they shared about their experience with supervision?
Well, of course, peer specialists are a rapidly growing workforce here in the United States, but also around the world. And it's interesting having an international perspective, a more global perspective, because I hear the same things here in the United States as I might hear if I go to Switzerland or Israel or South Korea. If peer specialists are working in clinical settings, whether that be a hospital, an ACT team, a rehab program, and they're being supervised by a non-peer, okay, someone who has a clinical background and it does not have their own lived experience of recovery, or I should say is not out about having their own experience, then very often there's a mismatch. People are complaining because my supervisor doesn't understand what I do is different from what the case managers do. So we find these, frankly, unhelpful scenarios where peer specialists are running to get coffee and they're driving vans and they're filing, but they're not doing peer work. And if they are, in some cases, they're doing junior social worker, junior case manager kinds of duties, which again, so I think to close that gap, training in terms of what does a peer specialist do? You know, not how is it defined, but what do you do when you're a peer specialist? What exactly do you do? I share the lived experience of my recovery. Yeah, but what do you like do?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you do? Because an employment specialist helps people get jobs, and a therapist does therapy, and a doctor does meds. And what do you do? And I think supervisors really struggle with that. And so hopefully we're going to make some progress there.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I've seen is, as the role of peers has expanded, greatly over the past couple of decades, training programs are out there, but then who's able to support them? And I know, that's what we're talking about today is when a peer specialist is working on a clinical team, it can feel, what I've heard from peers is very isolating. I'm not clear on what my job is. I went to a week-long training, but how do I put that into practice? I'm now in the real world. What does this look like? What do challenges look like for me? It may be different. And I think you also hit on a very important thing, which is, what I have felt for a long time is these are folks that have identified as having struggles and lived experience. I think many people in the field do, but they aren't called peers, right? And so we don't talk about some of those struggles, but in the peer world, it's out there and, people make a lot of assumptions. So I'm just really glad that, we can keep talking about how to really support peers, but knowing what your role is and then having the supervisor know and support that. Cause that case aid work, I've seen that all over the place too, where it's just sort of, very, never mind getting paid less, which is also horrible. People are full members of the teams, in my opinion. And, I think that's really important that there's a unique special skill set that I know you'll talk about. So I think that's huge. How, just in thinking about how the field, in as much as it is progressing, how have you seen equity, diversity, and inclusion impacting peer specialists, their roles, as well as supervision? I guess I'm thinking of, that just having more open ideas of the things we didn't know we were doing, microaggressions, assumptions, but, also some of these really big issues that also affect peers. How have you seen that roll along in our field?
Yeah, well, I think certainly that in many places around the United States, there's a heightened sensibility, a heightened awareness, and to some degree, a heightened receptivity to hearing about issues of systemic oppression and all sorts of inequities. And so I think we're learning the language about that, and we're starting to open our ears. And by us, I mean white people who are in dominant positions and being willing to at least hear voices that very often don't get to the table. That said, there is a tremendous differential and a long road ahead of us. We haven't even barely scratched the surface, I think. And that, so we have a lot to learn. And I think being humble about that. And also, I think being willing to really explore and in some ways celebrate the intersectionality of our differences. And therein, very often, finding certain kinds of common ground can be very, very powerful. And so, but we've got a long way to go. And I find that peer specialists in particular who have not only experienced like the kind of oppression, microaggression, et cetera, the systemic factors that can work against us by being a person with a mental health diagnosis. Right. We also see can be just totally compounded by being gay or transgender or being a person of color. I mean, being a person from a poor background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's tough.
Yeah, well, and just being, I think, ever increasingly sensitive to that compounded intersectionality that peers may bring to their jobs, that is both lived experience in lots of arenas, but also, has made people vulnerable in ways in certainly the mental health system, and assumptions around symptomology and pathologizing certain things. I just sort of think of all that stuff that, we just want to be sensitive to as we support peer specialists who also have other identities, in our field. So, well, I could talk to you all day, Pat. I really appreciate talking about how to support peer specialists with supervision. I think it's such an important aspect to really support this kind of work. So thank you so much. This has been fabulous. And now we'll let you get to your slides. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. Hey, everybody out there. I cannot see you, but I do believe you're there, which is good. I'm glad I believe you're out there. Anyway, welcome. And it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you today. I just want to start off, like I often do, and just to say thank you. I think in this field, we don't hear enough of that. We hear about how we fall short all the time, and many of us strive to be really effective in our work, and we wish we could even do better than we're currently doing. But I just want us to step back for a minute and receive a thank you from me. And to say that the work you do really does matter. And I know we're not getting the big bucks, okay? And Lord knows with increasing inflation, and the price of gas, it sure helps to have some money in the pocket, no doubt about it. But those of us who are in this work don't stick here because of the money. And if you do come in because you want to make a quick paycheck, I know that people will be in and out in less than 6 months. You can't do this work without a kind of passion, right? And I know that passion, that sense of purpose, my why in this work has to do with the fact that each and every one of you out there have been through a really difficult time in your life. And I don't care if you're a psychiatrist or if you're a therapist or if you're a peer supporter, every single one of us who comes to this work with our hearts and shows up every day is here because we have been through a difficult passage in our life. We emerged from the other side and we found that we weren't, eviscerated by it. We weren't destroyed by it. In fact, we were transformed by it. And this is what it means to embody hope. Hope being an attitude towards the future. It's not, hope isn't shallow optimism and just cheerleading, don't worry, be happy, everything will be fine. No, it might not be fine, actually, okay? And yet, I'm still willing to commit to you today that I will walk into tomorrow with you. And that's the commitment we make each and every time we show up at work. And that's a big, big deal because what we're helping to do ultimately is to provide good soil so that lives can rebirth themselves. And what could be more aerobic? I love that word, A-W-E, aerobic, aerobic. That's Lily Tomlin. What could be more aerobic than having the opportunity to see lives rebirthing themselves, okay? And so thank you for that. And on that note, as I mentioned, there is an increasingly and growing workforce of peer specialists out there. And yet it seems like the more we grow as a peer workforce, the more confusion is generated around what exactly do peer specialists do? What exactly is this role and how the heck do we supervise somebody who is working as a peer specialist if that's not our own unique background? And yet I believe that peer supervisors, even if we don't share that lived experience background, that experience of being diagnosed with mental illness and receiving mental health services, even if you've not had that experience, supervisors can be extremely helpful to individuals in remaining within the role of the peer specialist, even when working on a clinical team. Supervisors can be a great help and a great ally for that. So that said, I want to just preface and say that my remarks are focusing on peer specialists working in clinical settings. And what I mean by that is if you're a peer specialist and you're working in a peer-run organization, I think dynamics can be very, very different when it comes to supervision. My remarks today, I think there's still a lot to be learned from them, but is really focused at peer specialists working as part of a larger clinical organization with traditional staff from clinical backgrounds. So for today's purposes, I'm going to adopt Sherry Mead's definition of peer support, which is a system of giving and receiving help founded on key principles of respect, shared responsibility, and mutual agreement of what is helpful, right? I think this is a good working definition of peer support. It's also, like many definitions, a little bit hand-wavy, because when you scratch below the surface, it's like, well, what do you mean a mutual agreement of what is helpful, right? What if you and the person have a different idea of what could be helpful in this situation? Then what does a peer specialist do? So it's a good working definition. I also just want to preface real briefly by thanking some of my friends and colleagues, and in particular, for how much I've learned from them around what peer support is and how to do it well. And I want to acknowledge Darby Penny, who passed last fall. Darby was a real disruptive innovator when it comes to peer support, and was Director of Consumer Affairs for the state of New York. Celia Brown, of course, and more recently, Abby Duke, and Sasha DeBrule. I've been working with these folks for many years now, and they've been just great friends and colleagues in helping to develop many of the ideas and resources that I'm going to share with you today. So let's just step back in the time machine for 1 minute and reorient ourselves to where peer support comes from. In another lecture, another day, and in the earlier lecture in this series, I talked about the fact that I can date peer support easily into the 1700s and into the 1800s, right? So peer support is a natural response of reaching across with compassion when a person's hurting. It's peer support. It's what you do, and it's a beautiful thing. But in terms of more contemporary understandings of peer support, many people incorrectly assume that the modern peer support movement in mental health comes out of similar self-help groups for cancer support and multiple sclerosis support groups, Parkinson's support groups, etc. But the fact is that peer support in our current incarnation, in our current times, really does not find its roots in peer support groups or self-help mutual support groups for medical conditions. And many people don't know this. It's very important. Our movement finds its roots outside of medicine, always has, right? And so things like the modern movement, we find inspiration in the women's movement, right? In the civil rights movement, in the peace movements, disability rights movements. This is where our work has stemmed from. And that, we talk about this idea of standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, the giants whose shoulders we stand on today are the giants who were involved in these movements as well. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization there of ideas, etc. And the reason this is important is because for many, many years, the intensity and focus of our movement has been to develop alternatives to traditional mental health, okay? The roots of our movement are very much about finding alternatives. So peer respite, finding non-coercive, medication-free environments, peer support outside of mental health systems. But then, of course, government funding, and now certified Medicaid billable hours, and suddenly our workforce is both taking off and losing its direction at the same time, because we find ourselves in forensic facilities, inside hospitals, not alternatives to hospitals, but inside the hospital, working as part of a hospital system, perhaps. And so that is an opportunity, for sure, to reach peers in places where they really need peer support. It's an opportunity for us to do that. And at the same time, it's a challenge, because it's really, really easy to lose our way. So I want to just start by saying a few things that peer specialists do and don't. We do When we're working with people, we learn together and we're co-creating tools for success, but we do not prescribe help. In other words, we don't say things like, I know just the thing for you, you need a RAP plan. That's prescribing help, right? We seek to understand the person's evolving understanding of what's going on. People make meaning and are trying to figure out what's going on with them. But at the same time, we don't use clinical language, right? So if a person says, you know, I really think I'm having a spiritual emergence, we don't flip around. You know, I think they think it's psychosis, but I'm having a spiritual emergence, and we don't flip around and say, yeah, but excuse me, you lack insight into the fact that you're ill. We don't go there, right? We use peer-developed wellness tools, personal medicine coaching, wellness recovery action plans, the Hearing Voices Network, medication empowerment, okay? But we don't use clinical methods like motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, doing a suicide assessment. We don't go there. Excuse me, got allergies today. We support people in gathering resources to empower their own self-advocacy, but we don't get people to do things, get people to fill out a housing application, get people to take their medication. That's not what we do, okay? And so supervisors, a tip. Peer support is, as I said, a disruptive innovation. And what it does, precisely because it is not clinical, because it is peer, is it sets into motion a culture shift in the organizations that we work in. And as supervisors, this is the number one thing you need to know. In other words, we can all get very excited about peer specialists coming into the workforce in our organization, okay? And for good reason. It's quite a great contribution that they will make. However, be aware, it's not all pretty. There is a culture shift. And frankly, I've never met anybody who loves a culture shift. It's hard, okay? It's uncomfortable. It creates cognitive dissonance. And I'm going to give you 3 specific disruptions. And as supervisors, we need to know this because these forces will be set into motion in a clinical environment when a peer joins the team, okay? And if you know this as a supervisor, you're going to be 10 steps ahead of the game. So here we go. Disruption number 1. Disruption number 1 is that peer specialists, we are the evidence that recovery is real. We disrupt this age-old paradigm that serious mental illness is a chronic condition, okay? We explode the chronicity paradigm just by showing up at work. We're not trying to be mischievous, okay? We just show up and we're out about our history, okay? And we disrupt. Another thing that we do, that we disrupt by virtue of showing up in the morning at work, is that we raise the bar in terms of what's possible for outcomes of mental health services. What's possible in terms of recovery? Because we're peer specialists, we're living our lives. We're not living our diagnosis, okay? And we're saying stabilization, maintenance, which for too many decades has been the standard of a good outcome. They're stable. We got them maintained in the community, okay? That's a low, low bar. We show up, we say recovery is real, and that sitting in an apartment or in a group home is, there's more. Let's not stop there. Let's keep going. That's disruptive to the team. And finally, of course, we scramble all the academic theories, for instance, the chronic degenerating course of schizophrenia, right? That's a shift for a culture. Now, what's interesting is this first culture shift, okay, by virtue of showing up at work, peer specialists set this in motion. And here's what it sounds like on the ground in your programs. In my training, I was not taught about recovery. If recovery was common, I would have been trained to support recovery, okay? Does this mean my training and education are not relevant? These peer specialists, they're the exception. They're not like the people we work with, right? These peer specialists, they don't have advanced degrees and they lack training. So how could they truly be helpful in any way? Right, so we begin to hear this sort of dynamic. Disruption number 2. Peer specialists blur the boundaries between health and sickness. This is really important. Health and sickness. So historically, in mental health systems, there's sort of been a chasm between what I'll call the land of the well and the land of the unwell, the land of the sick, right? And sociologists talk about this, Talcott, Parsons, and others, Goffman all the time, you know, the two domains, the land of being well and the land of the sick, and never the two shall meet. They're distinct domains. So let me just give you a quick quiz here, heads up. Can you find the staff? I bet you can. I bet you can. So what am I talking about here? Well, what you can see by looking at this picture from, I think it's circa 1910, 1920, State Hospital, is you can clearly tell who were the well and who were the not so well, who are the sick, right? And that this distinction is codified in very, very specific cues that we can visually plug into. So one of the cues is what is the role? One is taking meds, one is distributing meds. So that's a role distinction, right? Another thing we can see very clearly is there's the uniform for the professional, for the well, and there's the loose-fitting cotton shifts for the mental patients. That's the other side, the unwell, right? But also when you really start thinking about it, this codification of the separation of the land of the well and the land of the unwell is taken right down into the way we build the buildings. So we've got the patient bathroom and we've got the staff bathroom, and we have the staff dining area and we have the patient dining area. And I could go on about this very real, yet largely unspoken tradition. Now, the era of peer specialists. I just pulled these randomly off of websites of current organizations. Tell me, can you find the staff? No, not really, right? We're mixing it up just by showing up. In other words, we're saying in truth, the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick is in fact an illusion. It's an illusion, people. It's a continuum, right? And on any given day, we can move our chip from one side to the other side or anywhere in between on that continuum. And that's a culture shift. It's a massive culture shift for clinical dominant cultures, right? And here's how it affects staff when we invite peer specialists in. Here's how the culture shift expresses itself. I have a trauma history. I was in therapy. Does that mean I'm a peer? You hear it all the time. I use psychiatric medication. Does that qualify as lived experience? I saw a counselor when I was a teenager. Does that mean I have to tell my clients that? People begin really wondering. I work as a social worker. When I was younger, I spent time in a psychiatric hospital. But that's my private life. Do they expect me to disclose my personal life at work? These are the kinds of very often unspoken machinations, culture shift, discomfort, cognitive dissonance that will be created when peer staff come into a program. Supervisors, critical that we know this, and you'll see why in just a moment. Final disruption, role conflict. So I have a cartoon here. We've got Dr. somebody, Dr. Smith. Good afternoon, Bob. And then we've got Dr. Bob saying to Dr. Smith, hello. And then they're both going to a meeting later that evening, okay? And now the physician says, hi, Bob, and he says, hello, Sue, right? So that captures that idea of role conflict. And the way this shows itself as a disruption in clinical culture is people thinking and saying things like, well, I remember when this peer specialist was a patient. in the hospital. Now he's my coworker. What do I do with that? The peer specialists seem to be having symptoms. Is it okay to say something to the peer specialist if they're having symptoms? What about my language when there's a peer specialist in the room? Now I have to talk differently during a clinical meeting or in the staff room because there's a peer here? There's a staff party after work tonight. That's a classic. I'm not sure if we should invite the peer specialist. I don't want to party with a peer specialist. I was supervising the peer specialist and the peer specialist told me she went off her meds. I didn't know what to say. Is that a clinical issue? Should I be concerned? Guaranteed. When peer specialists come to work, these issues emerge. Not in any particular order, but they emerge. So a tip for supervisors, beware of yourself drifting from your role as supervisor into a therapist role. Most of us have training in that background. And it's a very, very common error. I see it all the time where the supervisor starts moving into more of a therapeutic mode, confidant mode with the peer specialist. And the peer specialist probably has spent some time in therapy and quite nicely drifts to the complementary role of patient, okay? And once that starts happening, of course, that's a problem. And so being aware, okay, how am I engaging with the peer specialist? And in any way, is that different from, and in some ways it might be different from the role of when I'm supervising the social worker on the team, for instance, right? So this is a very common error, no easy answers, but we need to be aware that it's a very real dynamic. Now, as I mentioned, people, of course, we create cultures and nobody likes to change, right? And in particular, when a peer specialist shows up into a culture which has a dominant clinical purpose, okay, I call it a clinical culture, right? And these shifts, as I've mentioned, these disruptive shifts begin to happen. It can create a kind of cognitive dissonance, like, wait a minute, something's going on, but nobody's talking about it, and things are different, and I don't feel comfortable in this place. It's happening, okay? And what happens is the culture doesn't say, oh, wow, I get to change. No, the culture basically says, resist change. And there are two kinds of ways that cultures, generally speaking, will resist the disruption that's created just by the peer specialist just showing up at work. They're not trying to do anything, they just showed up, right? The first is microaggression, is one form of resistance. And the second is to assimilate the peer specialist into the clinical culture. So now we're going to briefly touch on these two kinds of resistance to the culture shift introduced by peer specialists. First, microaggressions. In this, the logic of this resistance strategy, and no one's sitting back intentionally doing it, it's just how we work socially as human beings, right? There's a shift taking place. The peer specialist is here. Things don't feel uneasy. They don't feel right. And so the peer specialist kind of gets siloed over here, the voice of recovery over here in their own little silo, and they become an outsider, and the team continues as usual. The peer specialist finds that they're not being treated as an equal, and eventually peer staff leave. They can't live with the duplicity of being both a part of the team, but not really, right? And the various and sundry forms of microaggressions that come up. So this is one guaranteed way, supervisor, that a peer specialist will experience some pushback to the culture shift. So here's an example of microaggression from my experience. I've, as you know, done a lot of public speaking over a lot of years now, and very often I start my lecture by sharing my experience of recovery. And when I first started doing that, it's a vulnerable space to stand up in front of a few hundred people and to share my story. And very often people were very kind and afterwards would queue up after my talk and thank me and ask some questions. That's great. But then I began to notice this weird thing happening. And I didn't know what it was. And what was happening is somebody would come up and they would have this really beautiful smile on their face. And they would say to me, this is really true. Thank you so much for your inspiring talk, Pat. I was wondering, how do you feel about being misdiagnosed with schizophrenia? And I would feel like, whoa, like if I was in Star Trek, it'd be like phasers on stun. I was just like deer in the headlights, like, whoa. And I didn't know why I was getting upset. I just knew that I was tongue-tied. What do you say to that? Thank you? I don't think so. Right? So it's a powerful thing. What's going on there? What's going on? So I would freeze, like, I'll read you what I wrote down here. I would smile, but it was a fake smile. My heart would race, and then I would feel really angry. What was this comment? The person seemed so friendly and nice and very sincere in making the comment to me. They opened with a compliment. They said my talk inspired them. But then this strange assertion that I had been misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. And at no point in my talk had I ever said that. The person told me that I had been misdiagnosed. And I would find myself wondering, do I need to go out and get my hospital records and wave them in front of her face in order to, and what's interesting is that after the talk, it had a corrosive effect on me. I began to doubt myself. Well, maybe I am exaggerating. Maybe I'm lying. Maybe I'm an imposter. Maybe it's all fake. Maybe I'm making this whole, did I make this up? And when you've been diagnosed with psychosis and someone is sort of saying in a twisted way that you made it up, oh boy, that talk about a trigger of vulnerability, there it was. This I later learned was what's called microaggression. And having a name for it, right, really helps. And I'm saying that similar microaggressions occur when that culture shift is set in motion. And the thing about microaggressions is they're rarely intentional. They're rarely well thought out ahead of time. Typically, they're quite unconscious, but boy, they can zing. Now, I want to just credit Chester Pierce. I learned about this construct of microaggression from a book he wrote called The Black 70s. The definition of microaggressions, this is one I like, are small acts of prejudice, whether they're intentional or not, that take a large toll on the person who's on the receiving end of the microaggression, right? And as you can see, that was a simple sentence that person would speak to me after the conference, and yet I could be spinning out on it for days after the experience, after it hit home. So here are some examples from actual peer specialists. I was having a hard time in my own recovery, but I kept coming to work because it helped me stay grounded and structured. And one day, when I got back from lunch, someone had put an advertisement for a psychiatric medication on my desk. Yikes. A group text went around to everyone on the team except me. They were planning to go out for drinks and celebrate a case manager's birthday. I wasn't supposed to find out. Ooh. Everyone was told we were getting business cards. We all filled out the forms. But when the team leader passed out the new cards a few weeks later, I was the only staff that did not get one. One day, I spoke up passionately during a team meeting. I felt the program participant was being treated unfairly. And after the meeting, my supervisor told me I was being unprofessional. He said I had to stop personalizing the issue. Wow. These are all examples of microaggressions, right? And with a good, trusting supervisory relationships, peer specialists will hear a message from you if you give it, that you welcome them to speak about things that just don't feel quite right, comments that they found off-putting or hurtful or devaluing of them. And so here are some tips. Number one, validate the peer specialist. As I mentioned, those of us who've been psychiatrically labeled are particularly prone to being told that we're exaggerating, we're making it up, we're not seeing reality. Okay, we've got to reality test this. First, we need to hear, I can see that you're really upset, and I would be too. We need that validation. The next thing that needs to happen, I think, is that as supervisors, we need to begin focusing on the team, introduce the construct of microaggression, and start talking openly about the culture shift. Hopefully, we are able to do that before the peer specialist joins the team, but if not, we need to start talking about what's different, what's the same with the peer specialist present. One of the things I like to emphasize is that in a situation of culture shift, if we get into a policing function where we're policing language and policing the right attitude and we're doomed. It'll just all go way underground, okay? We've really got to frame this as, guys, we're all growing. The peer specialist is growing, I'm growing, the team is growing, we're changing. It's uncomfortable. I like a suggestion I concretely use is you put well, this is the days when there were quarters. Nobody has a quarter anymore. Maybe chips or something. And everybody gets their own distinct color chip. And you just have a little bucket in the middle of the table where the team meets. And if you blow it, if you make the mistake, you offer the apology and you put your chip in, and we all, I don't know, get an ice cream at the end of the year or something. You know what I'm saying? Just something that acknowledges, okay, but I'm not a bad person because I said this or whatever. And sometimes it is necessary, unfortunately, to speak privately with repeat offenders, with staff who just don't seem to be getting on board with the peer specialist being a valued member of the team, right? And I have seen instances in which team members have had to leave employment because of just not being able to accept that this change is valued by the administration, by the organization, and makes for better quality care of individuals. So a couple more tips. I find that sometimes teams are very, very busy these days, more than ever, with the attrition in the workforce. And sometimes teams are in a hurry and use a lot of verbal shorthands and get impatient with a non-clinical perspective. And that the team needs a reminder that if a peer specialist is talking during a clinical meeting, they're not necessarily off topic if they're talking about how a situation looks from the perspective of the program participant. In fact, that's exactly what their job is, to represent as best as possible the perspective of the peer of the program participant, so that the team understands that viewpoint. So we'll be talking more about that in a moment. We've got to invite and make room in the meeting for peer specialists to speak up. And we need to recognize, and I'll show you an example of this in a minute. I think one of the things that peer specialists do extremely well is to deepen the clinical formulation into a more holistic and resilient story of a human being, right? Because our clinical formulations can get pretty dry. And I think peer specialists really help to deepen our appreciation of the client as a human being in a way that's very, very special. I mentioned the second kind of culture shift, assimilation of the peer specialist into clinical culture. So microaggression is very often results in a peer specialist leaving. In this second form of culture shift, the assimilation of the peer specialist into clinical culture, essentially what happens is that the peer specialist just becomes just like other members of the team. And so we've done away with the culture shift. There is no shift. We're remaining clinical, right? Very, 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 very common. So I call it drift, when peer specialists are thinking and speaking and documenting and acting like clinicians, right? And this is a real problem, and it's extremely widespread, and we need to work against it. I'm going to give you 3 examples of classic drift. A peer worker in a state hospital said to her supervisor, "I was working with a patient who was non-compliant with her diabetic diet. In order to motivate her, I showed her pictures of people whose feet had been amputated. And she never knew about that. It was like a wake-up call for her, and it really helped." Okay, this is drift. away from the peer specialist role. And the specific signs of drift include that peer specialists are never in a fixer role in relation to the peer. In fact, peer specialists sometimes will share that they're having a rough day and allow the program participant, if they feel moved to say something helpful to them. There's a real mutuality, a give and take, which is not at all what goes on in a clinical relationship necessarily, right? It's not certainly not a formal part of a clinical relationship. It can be very healing to experience myself not just as a consumer of care, but a giver of care. That's the healing power of that reciprocity and mutuality. In the instance of drift, we see a peer specialist is trying to motivate and therefore really isn't working side by side with the peer. We shouldn't be doing things to a peer. We're not trying to motivate them. Using a scare tactic, which is all about having power over instead of reaching across. Trying to achieve patient compliance through a diabetic diet is not peer work. Clinicians try, but it's not peer work. Working on a goal that may not be the peer's goal. That, above all, is a hallmark of peer support. Working on the peer's goal. And finally, using clinical language such as patient and non-compliance. Let's look at another one. This was the opening paragraph in a short clinical presentation for a clinical team. The clinical narrative went like this. This is what I call a clinical formulation. LM is a Black cisgender female in her early 20s who began working with the team in March 2022. She's bright, motivated, and engaged with the team. She's been experiencing auditory hallucinations prior to working with us. She's currently in college, but unable to complete the semester because she's failing her coursework. Her hallucinations are preventing her from being productive at school. She recently started responding inappropriately to internal stimuli. She presents as distraught and often cries out of frustration with the voices. In March, she was prescribed olanzapine, which seemed to help decrease the intensity of the voices. However, for the past 2 weeks, LM has refused to take meds, stating they are unhealthy for her, and the team is concerned that she lacks insight. Okay? So that's a clinical narrative. Okay? And it has its place. I'm not saying never do clinical, but peer specialists don't do clinical. So the peer specialist was in this clinical meeting, hearing the reading, and chips in during the discussion. LM is home now, and I could reach out to her sister to see if she'd be willing to supervise LM's medication compliance. And this is a clear sign of drift. Well, what are our indicators? Our indicators is that the peer specialist, once again, is in a fixer role in relation to the peer. The peer specialist is not transparent and is going behind the participant's back to plan with the sister, is trying to achieve patient compliance with meds, and is, again, working on a goal that may not be the peer's goal. None of these things fly in the authentic peer role. So what would an alternate be? What could the peer specialist do that is consonant with the role? The peer specialist deepens the clinical formulation, the clinical narrative, deepens it into a more fully human and often much more complicated human story than the clinical story, okay? And here's what I mean by that. This is true peer support. Some of the voices LM hears are really wonderful. They comfort her and help her believe she's really special. LM doesn't take the meds because they interfere with those good voices. She doesn't want to get rid of them. That's real peer support. You see how peer support is looking at the perspective, at the world, at what's going on from the point of view of the participant, right? And in so doing, communicates to the team an often more complex, but also deeply personal experience of what gets called clinically symptoms, right? I think this is a very beautiful example of the power of peer support. When we assimilate a peer into clinical culture, so they're just being a junior case manager, we lose this depth, this richness, and this is what's lost when we resolve culture shift prematurely. Third example, this has to do with documentation. Supervisors should be intimately involved in tracking supervisees' documentation of encounters with program participants. So a supervisor comes in and notices this note in the record from a peer specialist. John and this writer met in the park today. He was agitated, needed to walk the whole time, and was very delusional. He thought he was being watched. So clearly you're picking up that this is drift, right? This is a clear indicator of drift. He's being judgmental. The peer specialist is writing like a clinician, using clinical words, and in a sense, saying this person is delusional. This is descriptive. We want peer specialist documentation to be truly descriptive. John and I met in the park today. John didn't want to sit on the park bench or play chess the way we often do. Instead, he wanted to walk really fast. He said he felt scared. He was being followed. I told him I was good with fast walking if that helped him feel safer. After a half hour of fast walking, he said he felt like going home. He thanked me for hanging out, and he didn't feel so alone. If he wants to talk when we meet next time, I'll ask if fast walking with another person is personal medicine, maybe, and that helps him feel safer. So anyways, we really want to focus on not judgment, because judgment would be a sign of drift, or assessment. We don't want people doing assessing for delusions or psychosocial, any depression, but being descriptive. Simply human, simple description is often much more powerful with the peer specialist. So a tip for supervisors: let's role model person-first language for the whole team, and not just expect recovery and recovery-oriented language to be siloed in the peer, but let's see you as the supervisor role modeling that recovery-oriented approach with the team. Really, the gold standard for peer specialists doing documentation is to do collaborative documentation, to invite the individual that they're seeing that day to help write the note, right? Or to text them a summary of what they felt happened today and including that in the note, okay? And of course, as a supervisor, it's always wise to review documentation and to not just pick out what's not working, but when a peer specialist has been done a good job of being descriptive and non-judgmental, to highlight that and reinforce that for people. Another really good tip, if we keep peer specialists and urge and support peer specialists in using peer developed tools, it's a good way to help people stay in role. We know if people are doing a RAP plan, most of the time they're going to be within role, right? But that said, importantly, peer specialists are not to prescribe wellness tools for anybody. So if we say, oh, we do RAP here, or we only do RAP here, I do a RAP with all my clients, that's not a good sign, right? I do RAP with clients who are interested in doing RAP and want to get behind that as a goal. So I think it's best to make sure that peer specialists as a supervisor are skilled in using many different tools, and to remember that recovery-oriented tools really don't compete with each other as much as they complement each other, because they're reflecting the same value. So just a quick tour of some of my favorite tools. This particular one is by the Icarus Project and Madness and Oppression, Paths to Personal Transformation and Collective Liberation. It's a great pamphlet. It's free. You can download it. And it gets people pulling back the lens and realizing, well, mental health issues aren't all in my head. There's something very stressful about being poor. There's something very stressful about practicing Islam in America right now. You know, it's just, there are stressors. So it's a great way to widen the lens. TMAPs, transformative mutual aid practices. My friend Sasha and Jax McNamara developed this great tool. It's free, it's online. Just stick in TMAPs and you'll come to it. But again, it's a great way to talk about who I am and how I understand myself and the emerging meanings of what it is that I'm going through. It can be done collaboratively, can be done together. And of course, peer specialists, whenever we're using a new tool, we use it first for ourselves, right? Of course, there's the 8 Dimensions of Wellness, Peggy Swarbrick. It's another peer supporter, peer specialist. And SAMHSA has a free version of her 8 Dimensions of Wellness right there online. Psychiatric Advanced Directives. You can't go wrong with these. This is a free app. You can download it from SMI Advisor, or actually, no, you actually download it from either the Google Play or Apple App Stores, right? PAD, Psychiatric Advanced Directives. So what it does is it helps people create a plan where if they're going to go to the hospital, person can say, I don't like these meds, meds work better for me, I don't want any meds, here's my supporter, my designated supporter. Here's how I like to be supported when I'm hearing distressing voices, whatever it might be, you can put it all into your Psychiatric Advanced Directive on your phone, right? And of course, make a paper copy these days because they take our phones away when we get admitted, right? And have it with you and let the team know it's there and have a designated supporter. I want to give a shout out to my own personal medicine coaching. My certified personal medicine coaching community is international. It's all over the world. Canada, South Korea, Scotland, Ireland, Israel, Australia, England, Italy. We'd love to have you join us. We learn how to help people create personal medicines, the things I do to be well. This idea that, that the pathway into recovery is not just about sitting around taking psychiatric meds. Yeah, meds can be helpful. But self-care, the things I do to help myself are just as helpful. And that together it can create a pathway into the life we want. So here's an example of what personal medicine coaches learn to do. They learn to use our personal medicine cards. This one on the front of the card, they look like this. You can hold up, this is my card here, and then you personalize them on the back. So it can be helpful to think of our voices as an early warning system, trying to protect us from harm. Seen from this perspective, voices may be trying to help us. Using our compassionate self, we can thank them for the warning and tell them we'll stay safe as we go about our day. And on the back of the card is where I customize my self-help. And this is not just a coping strategy, it's deeply personal. So if my voices, no two voices are the same, if my voices are saying, keep your eyes down, then I can practice saying, I'll definitely be careful. Thanks. They're laughing at you. Thanks, I'll put earbuds in. You're radioactive. I'm on it now. You can rest now. It's approaching our voices with compassion instead of, the anger, which so often we fuel. Here's another one. This is my favorite one. This is, I struggle a lot with anger. So on the front of the card, remove my crown. Often we get angry when we think that things should go our way. For example, other drivers should never cut me off, or I should be able to go to the front of the line at a restaurant. Don't you just love that? My partner should attend to my needs first. I love that one. We act entitled like we're royalty. Maybe it's time to take off our crown. And then we customize, of course, for ourselves. In the back, we fill out, traffic should never interfere with me getting to where I need to be in a timely and comfortable manner. This one is my personal one. I truly get angry at traffic for getting in my way. So how do I remove my crown? I say, well, traffic is not out to get me, and it really doesn't single me out no matter what. I can change my route or leave earlier. And yes, it does help me because it reminds me that I'm not the center of the universe. Traffic's not personal, and I leave it in my car. And if I'm going someplace where I'm likely to encounter traffic, I make a discipline of reviewing my crown and taking it off before I get behind too far down the road. So personal medicine coaching, it's an amazing thing. We've got an amazing group of people involved, including people from all over the United States. And we'd love to have you join us someday. And my latest invention, you ready for this? It's called medication empowerment. It's about me, medication empowerment, support to get the to get the services that are right, the treatment that's right for us. So the best way for me to explain what medication empowerment is, I think historically there's been this taboo about peer specialists talking to people about medications, and I could not disagree more. I think it's a critical thing to be able to support people in talking effectively with their doctors about medication. So I have a whole curricula and a suite of tools, of course. And let me show you what that looks like.
I feel over-medicated, like I'm on too much medicine. I'm not motivated to take these meds. The meds have changed me in ways I don't like. These meds aren't working. I like to get high rather than take meds. I'm concerned about how meds are affecting my health. These are some of the challenges on the journey to use psychiatric medication optimally to support recovery. Medication empowerment is a guided intervention that helps clinical teams and peer supporters identify and support folks through these challenges. Medication empowerment helps folks have a voice and a choice in finding the treatment that is right for them.
Okay.
I feel.
And finally, so medication empowerment is another, great tool for peer specialists to use in order to stay peer in their work with the individuals that they're serving. So there's lots of choices, lots of options, and the idea is for supervisors to get people involved with as many of these different tools as possible, and then have a wide variety from which a person receiving services can choose from. I have, as you know, I'm a believer in tools, and I've got something very special for supervisors of peer specialists out there. Your handout for today is the supervisor checklist for peer supporters. It's a 2-page document, and it is a checklist in the spirit of Atul Gawande's checklist manifesto. It's a great way to stay on target in the supervision of a peer specialist. And we use these in OnTrackNY New York, and they're very, very helpful to supervisors, because it helps me just check in with the peer supporter. Am I remaining peer? Am I helping to influence the organizational culture? Am I communicating well with my team? How's my connection with my team and with family, etc.? So in particular, the whole section here, remaining peer, kind of summarizes many of the points that I've made here today, and should be easy to use. And, peer supporters in supervisors in OnTrack, we use these typically once a month, but it's too much to go through the whole checklist in one session. But pick out the part that you're concerned about. Maybe you went through somebody's documentation and found the slippage into clinical language, okay? That might become a good opportunity to use the checklist with somebody and say, okay, how can we help you get back on track with what it is that a peer specialist should be doing in this situation, and how might we phrase this? And so remaining peer is a great place to start with using this worksheet. So that is what I have prepared, and I'm really looking forward to a good chat. So I'll stop sharing now and open it back up. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Pat. Well, excuse me. I just want to say I'm pretty sure this is a new record for number of questions that we have in a webinar. And so I'm going to do my best, but I do want to make sure everyone on the call and who has had to leave early, we tried to put this in the chat, that our aim, because there are so many good questions in a lot of these events, we take all the questions that are asked and put them in like a highlight key concept document. And so if we don't get to all your questions today, we will send them to Pat to just make sure, in case you have, a short answer you might type in. So then that can be shared with anybody that either was or wasn't at this event. So I did want to just make sure you knew that. I'll start with the first one, because that was right off the bat, and want to make sure George's question gets addressed. Indeed, the surge of fatal overdoses and suicides shows the ineffectiveness of the mental health system and its medical brain model, evidence-based practices. How do you distinguish the philosophy and practices of peer services, perhaps based on practice-based evidence of effectiveness?
Well, I will never subscribe to the idea that all clinical or evidence-based services are misdirected, because they're not. I think many of them represent extraordinary breakthroughs in our field. So let's just for a moment highlight supported employment as an extraordinary psychosocial intervention with a much larger effect size than any known psychiatric medication. We've got 20-something randomized controlled trials across populations all over the world. And we know that giving people the opportunity to get a job and to work if they express interest in working is powerful medicine, right? So I need to say that to begin with. There is a clear distinction, and I think I've been making it a number of times here today, between clinical services and peer support. And I think that there is always at work the evidence that I'm learning and gathering by virtue of being a living human being, the wisdom of our experience. The thing that's interesting, of course, is that clinicians have their own lived experience, their own wisdom. I mean, we all are learning. We're all learning, right? That said, I think I've been very clear that there are very significant differences between a peer support orientation. And I think that, I look to people, leaders like Nev Jones, who is doing really important work, trying to increase the voice of people with lived experience in the research and academic world. For instance, we ask very, very different questions, which potentially can lead to very, very different kinds of inquiries and studies, which will do nothing but enrich anybody who's got a mental health challenge. So I do think that the lived experience wisdom is huge, but not without error. I mean, there have been times when what worked for me really doesn't work for somebody else. And so I guess I like the idea of practicing humility and being open and recognizing that somewhere in all of this, there's really good wisdom, and we're just trying to pick out the good stuff, the stuff that really, really works. So thanks for your question. It's great.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm going to try and blend a couple of questions together, and I've seen this in chat as well. So you obviously have distinguished between clinical work and peer work, yet a few people have asked, hey, I'm sometimes finding things like motivational interviewing or CBT as a technique. And I don't want to guess what your answer might be, but what would you say to peers that are asking, is it inappropriate for me to use some of these other tools if I get the training like others might? Is there a room for blending of those, peer perspectives and some of these clinical tools, or what's your perspective on that?
I do believe they're separate. Both have tremendous value. But if I'm going to be doing motivational interviewing, or if I'm going to be doing CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, then I need to be in a therapist role. And I can still have lived experience, and I can, if I choose to, share my experience, but I need to be a trained CBT practitioner. And I think that peers do not assess peers. For instance, in motivational interviewing is a wonderful, wonderful breakthrough. I mean, in terms of how to work with people who appear unmotivated. However, when I say somebody is in the pre-motivation stage or the ambivalent stage, what I've just done is conduct an assessment and make a judgment. And peer specialists do not do that. Now, I'd be naive to say that as human beings, peer specialists are judgment-free, because no human being is. We all have a perspective, a point of view. But to the best of our ability as peer specialists, we're trying to minimize the assessment, the judgment. And a foundational principle in motivational interviewing is, if I determine that you're at the stage of ambivalence, pre-contemplation stage, right? My job is to work with you in a very specific way to get you to the stage of action where you're going to do something. Right. Peers don't do that to peers, period. And so I know that I may be ruffling some feathers out there, and that's okay, you know. But at the same time, because I'm learning and growing too, and if someone wants to point me wrong, go for it. But I do see a lot of peer specialists, particularly in the drug alcohol recovery arena, you know, being trained explicitly at the state level for certification in motivational interviewing. And I really struggle with that. I'm not sure that's at all, it doesn't reflect peer values if you dig into what motivational interviewing really is. So I do make the distinction. There are things peer specialists do that clinicians don't do, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing you say, because people are obviously responding in the chat, is that how you actually do your work. I mean, obviously you're not prescribing any, you know, one do exactly the way you're saying, but be clear what you are doing. So if you are doing peer work, there are values and practices and a spirit behind that that you have articulated well here. If you are going to do a prescribed intervention, be mindful that you can't maybe truly do both, because you have, like you said, in MI, you have a path that you now are trying to do, and that's not aligned with the peer values of, you know, side by side, and, you know, really just valuing the present and being, you know, a true peer, that you're trying to conduct some intervention perhaps. So I hope I'm summarizing that okay. But, you know, I agree. I mean, I think that so many of these things in spirit, like the idea that you're not the expert, say for MI, that is a great thing to kind of keep in mind. But if you are trying to get someone moving along on the path of motivation, that may be in conflict, it sounds like what you're saying, with the true peer experience and the peer perspective. Do I have that kind of right?
Well, it doesn't reflect peer values.
Yeah.
And the values of peer support. And so it put you against the model. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Another person, and I've seen this as well. So to become a peer supervisor in one state, you have to be supervised by someone with a license, doctor, nurse practitioner, other licensed professional. Wondering, in all your experience in your international work, how do recovery organizations operate as a true peer-led organization when those requirements are there? I think that also is a rub in the system, right? Like even having Medicaid reimbursement for peers, there's all these hoops and requirements. And so how can an organization and constraints like that be moved along in the progression of the field?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are a lot of misguided, you know, regulations that are intent on making sure that peer support doesn't, I don't know, go off the rails or something. I don't know. It's just, you know, and it does reflect the lack of trust in the profession of peer support. And I think that in time, we will, like other guilds, like other associations, develop our own self-monitoring. I don't think we're there yet. And, you know, some of us are hoping that the Biden White House, you know, puts out some invitations so that we can begin to develop that sense of being professional. I don't think that being a professional, a paid professional, is antithetical to peer support, although I do agree that peer support has always and will always be an informal thing that people do when they reach across some compassion to love another person. That will never be regulated.
Yeah, and that's tough. That kind of blends into when people have identified and worked as peer specialists, and then maybe they change to a different role, or they are, as I was just noting in the chat, that people make assumptions about peers, and even worse, how can we help teams understand these microaggressions and do better? I think a lot of your slides and material do sort of get at some of that, but how do we, I think it's that disruption that you've described. It makes people off balance. They don't know what to make of the field as they knew it. And so how does this fit? But how do we try to break down these, especially these negative stereotypes, these assumptions that something, what I've seen is, oh, you mentioned people are, not having a good day. I must now jump into this clinical role with the staff. Whereas, would you do that for the therapist? Would you do that for the psychiatrist? Would you do that for the nurse on your team? So how do we break down some of these walls that are still up there? I don't know if you had anything to add to that kind of question.
Well, I think it's a huge thing, and it's a process, of course, and it takes time. What is clear is that it's not up to the peer specialist on a team to be the educator and the trainer for the team on these issues. I'd be happy to do a course for this gathering at some time on microaggression and the practice of microresistance, how we can counter at both the interpersonal and systemic level, because microaggression is widespread. And what can we do both to protect, but also, like you're mentioning, take strides forward so that the next generation perhaps doesn't have it quite as intensely, and for the program where, your peer specialist supervisor has to be, get a documentation right off from a psychiatrist or whomever, psychologist, whatever, is get a good one, because that's a whole other kind of advocacy to get those kind of regulations changed. And like I say, I'm hoping that we get a national, that we establish a national organization for ourselves, and that we develop our own guidelines and our own rules that are consonant with our values and culture.
Let's see. I'm trying to, there's so many great questions. I know we're limited on time. I think one that was asked, when you are working as peer, some places require that you have certain education. I know it's very, I guess really what have you seen? This may not answer this person's specific question because it is from a specific state, but each state has such varied things. Like, what does it look like in the US right now as far as people being able to bill for peer work? I know it's probably different in every state. Do they, do all states have certifications? I think not, but maybe they're working on it. And, I think just trying to balance that, and really the assumption that peers maybe don't already have education. That's kind of an underlying assumption there too, as well, that people, I think, can go between different roles and have come to peer roles that I've seen with lots of education. But how do you balance those requirements to put those things in place so the system can bill for peer services, but then sometimes that rubs against what the peer in front of you has, and they can't maybe do the job if they don't meet those requirements?
Yeah, I know. It's real tricky. And then sometimes some of the certification training itself doesn't reflect peer values at all at times. And that's like a trip. So you become certified and then have to forget what you learned in order to be really peer.
Yeah.
Or certain aspects of what you learned, usually not the whole thing. But so yeah, it's a bit of a Tower of Babel out there, and it's all growing pains. It's all good. I mean, I think, as much as possible, for us to influence through advocacy at the state level.
Yeah. And again, I think of your disruption that, these systems have been from a very prescribed medical model, a lot of times billing and government and all that kind of stuff, doesn't really honor, I think, that lived experience. And so how do we continue to disrupt, and really, like you said, people are afraid people are going to go off the rails or something. And I think that's a real thing. People experience. I know it's true that people fear that, but where does that come from? And how do we sort of address that? Because that's not the reality. There's a lot of organizations out there. So thank you so much, Pat. We could do this for days and days. I would love to take you up on the offer to do a specific, microaggression and how to help people deal with that, because I imagine a lot of folks in the audience today who have, working as peers, it still happens. And so we'd love to really support people in real practical ways. I just want to thank everybody. I know we're about to wrap up. Your feedback is so important and it's so helpful. And, I know just from the reactions, we will absolutely try to capture all your questions and get those answered in as best ways that we can. Just a couple of other upcoming events this week. If you're interested, we have a third of a 3-part series with our National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC on incorporating strategies to effectively engage Hispanic and Latinx clients. This has been a great series. The other 2 recordings are available. And then on Thursday, we have co-occurring disorders, compassionate care for healing and recovery. We're so grateful to see you. We'll leave up the chat for a few minutes as we close the room in case you want to connect with us. If you aren't getting our newsletter, you can do that on our website. Thank you so much. Pat, it's always an honor, and it's always so inspirational. And I know everyone feels the same. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Take care.